All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. And something happened to me. This may have happened to you. I'm driving down the road, I'm listening to the radio, and the top of the hour news guy says, well, some crazy, terrible things went down in Kyrgyzstan today. There's a revolution in the street. And I'm thinking to myself, who and what is Kyrgyzstan? What's going on there? Where could I go to find out about Kyrgyzstan? And why would it have anything to do with me or the United States of America? Why would I be concerned? Well, I have your answer. Justin Raimondo. He writes behind the headlines for antiwar.com. And it would be impossible for something to happen in Kyrgyzstan without Justin having a couple of 1,000-word column explaining the entire situation to you up that night. And that is why I read behind the headlines 3 times a week. And I have for a long time, long before I worked there, so I'm not just kissing up to my boss. Justin Raimondo is the author of Reclaiming the American Right, The Lost Legacy of the Conservative Movement, An Enemy of the State, The Life and Times of Murray and Rothbard, Into the Bosnia Quagmire, Enigma, 9/11 and the Israeli Connection. Writes for Chronicles magazine. He's a contributing editor for the American Conservative magazine. He's an adjunct scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute of Austrian Economics, and he's the editorial director of antiwar.com. Welcome back to the show, Justin.
Great to be here.
All right. Now, the Ukrainian Template is the topic of today's show. It's the latest rage going on in the world. What is the Ukrainian Template, Justin?
Well, what the U.S. does is they pick their favorite opposition group inside a country whose government they want to overthrow. They pick a color, red, blue, green, whatever, and then they start the revolution. And the first item on the agenda is to start paying these people off, start subsidizing their groups, start printing up placards. For example, in Azerbaijan, yesterday I think it was, actually today, we had 10,000 opposition protesters chanting freedom and carrying pictures of George W. Bush.
Yeah, there's no oxymoron there.
How blatant can you get? And it just so happens that Azerbaijan is the site of the newest oil pipeline in the Caucasus.
Oh, come on. Surely that's just a correlation without causation.
And apparently several $1 trillion worth of oil is going to be pumped through Azerbaijan, but not before Azerbaijan has some regime change.
I see. Their current government is not particularly friendly to the U.S. Is that it?
Well, it's not that. It's sort of a neutral government. Their government now, the former dictator, Mr. Aliyev, died, and his playboy son was put in his place. And prior to that, like Azerbaijan had been pretty pro-U.S., no problem. A typical Central Asian dictatorship where people were disappeared routinely. There's no opposition press. There's no such thing as democracy, of course.
Well, and here comes the USA to save the day. All right, everybody, it's the Weekend Interview Show. We'll be right back with Justin Raimondo from antiwar.com. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Justin Raimondo. He's the author of the book Reclaiming the American Right, The Lost Legacy of the Conservative Movement, and he is the editorial director of antiwar.com. We're talking about the color-coded revolutions, what Justin calls the Ukrainian Template. And I guess we basically got out of the way that what we're talking about here is the West dumps in a bunch of money to fund a bunch of young people, and they all wear the same color shirt and throw a rock concert and have sort of, it seems like so far, peaceful revolutions. I wonder if we can just sort of go through in order. The first of these color-coded revolutions really was in Georgia a couple of years ago, right?
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
The Rose Revolution, they called that
Right. And they sent a bunch of money there, and they put Mr. Saakashvili in power, and he is now, I mean, basically the idea is to encircle Russia. And they want to get all these countries around Russia in the former Soviet Union to be in the U.S. camp, sort of a reverse version of the Warsaw Pact. So, they have the Rose Revolution, and that worked out pretty bloodlessly. But you have to understand that the result in Georgia, for example, was far from democratic. There are several other countries subsumed in Georgia. There's Abkhazia, which is a separate country and has been a separate country, and yet Georgia claims it. So they want their independence, and they tend to be more pro-Russian. So there's been a war, going on there, and apparently the U.S. is taking the part of the Georgians. And that's what Edward Shevardnadze, who was Saakashvili's predecessor, was also doing. He was fighting the Abkhazians. So, the policy of the government there hasn't really changed. Torture still goes on. If you look at Amnesty International's report on Georgia, I wouldn't want to be arrested in that country for anything.
Well, if his predecessor, Saakashvili's predecessor, was basically doing the same thing, why was he regime changed?
Well, because it's all about foreign policy. I mean, they don't care what you do inside the country as long as news of it doesn't get out.
The relationship with Russia is really what was important there.
Right.
Well, whatever happened to convergence, Justin? I thought the whole point after the Cold War was to sort of combine Russia and America together in one big NATO all around the Northern Hemisphere. Whatever happened to that?
Well, they're working on it. But you have to understand that after the overthrow of communism, they still insisted on being independent of the United States, and that's not allowed. So true convergence means U.S. domination. That's how it works in Washington.
Okay, not a compromise.
Right. And also you have to understand that, the people who are driving U.S. foreign policy, otherwise known as the neoconservatives, hate Russia. And they hate Russia for a lot of reasons. But, the main one is that they want revenge. I mean, they want to smash up the former Soviet Union into so many different pieces that, it can be easily dominated by the United States. And that's what's happening.
And so really the project now, all these color-coded revolutions, is really just a matter of encircling Russia.
Right. I mean, that's the geopolitical strategy now in place.
Now, problem here is they still have thousands of nuclear weapons on intercontinental ballistic missiles. Am I right?
Right.
So how far can we actually push Russia before it's too far?
Well, I mean, they're not going to launch those missiles in response to a color-coded revolution inside Russia, are they? No. So,
well,
this is a
if
way
they knew
to
it was
disarm them.
America doing it, I mean, if we had a color-coded revolution here that we knew was backed by Moscow, our government would respond against Russia, wouldn't it?
I don't think so. No. And I mean, and that's not really a possibility. I mean, Russia doesn't have the resources.
Oh, sure. Well, I'm hypothetically speaking. But.
Right. But, I mean, it's very hypothetical. And I don't think anybody would launch, nuclear weapons in this day and age, especially, in response to something like that.
Do you think that the Russian government is strong enough to withstand a color-coded revolution? Or do you think that it would be basically as successful as it has been in Georgia and Ukraine and such?
I think that Vladimir Putin is very popular inside Russia, even more so now that he's getting rid of the oligarchs like Khodorkovsky. But according to the Russian Constitution, he cannot run again. So he has two options. Number one is to extend his term and have a referendum on changing the Russian Constitution. Now if he did that, that would mean an open conflict with the West, because the West doesn't like that. We're allowed to change our Constitution, of course, but they aren't allowed to change theirs. So if he tries that, it'll be open hostility, though I fail to see how it could get much more open, though it probably could. And the second alternative is to find a Putin substitute, with Putin in the background really running the show, somebody as a front man for him, which I don't see happening. I mean, there's no figure comparable to Putin. So that's going to be a problem.
So the strength of the government really does depend on the man in the chair. The government doesn't really have that broad base of a support regardless of who's in power.
Right. I mean, it's just that Putin has been such a strong figure, a czar-like figure, that the Russian nationalists and the Russian liberals and all sorts of ordinary people have rallied around him. And, the Russians are taking preventative measures because, of course, they foresee this new color-coded revolution, well, they haven't chosen a color yet, happening in Russia. And they set up a youth movement. I forget the name of it, but it's a patriotic youth movement to sort of preempt a U.S.-backed youth movement such as occurred in Yugoslavia and in the Rose Revolution in Georgia. Actually, the real template is not the Ukraine. It's Yugoslavia, Otpor. I mean, that's where it all started. Remember back during the Kosovo War, you had Slobodan Milosevic as the new Hitler, and he was, the last dictator standing in Europe, supposedly, and Clinton was on the warpath against him. And so what you had there was a U.S.-backed youth movement called Otpor. And, they started all those demonstrations that led to the downfall of Slobodan Milosevic. Though in that case, what happened was that it wasn't a black or white situation. I mean, you had, the hardline communists who were pro-Slobodan Milosevic, and then you had the pro-Western Otpor kids who were basically trained and subsidized by the West. And then you had genuine nationalists like Vladislav Kostunica, who is now the president, of course, of Serbia. And Kostunica really stepped into the breach and said, enough of Mr. Milosevic and enough of these Western subsidized kids. Let's put Serbia first and have a real democracy. So, of course, he opposed the Kosovo War. He opposed U.S. aggression, but he also opposed Slobodan Milosevic. So, a Western-style coup was temporarily averted in Serbia or in the former Yugoslavia. But that's where a template was first forged, in the former Yugoslavia.
Well, and it really is a good idea. It's hard to gun down a bunch of children and all wearing the same brightly colored clothes. It's, hard to portray them as the kind of dangerous mob that violence has to be used against, right?
Well, it is, but it happens, like in Uzbekistan, for example. Mm-hmm. There was a demonstration there, and, of course, 500 people were killed. And, of course, the U.S. response to that has been very dulled, compared to its response. I mean, imagine if that had happened in, say, Georgia or in say, Belarus.
Well, so what's the difference then between Uzbekistan and Belarus?
Well, of course, the difference is that Uzbekistan totally supports the U.S. so-called war on terrorism. There's a U.S. base there. We have good relations with Islam Karimov, the absolute dictator of Uzbekistan.
And by good relations, you mean he tortures people for us sometimes?
That's right. We send people to him, and it's called rendition, and he tortures them and gets supposedly valuable information out of them. Though I fail to see how anyone could take seriously any information that was gotten via torture.
All right, it's the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton talking with Justin Raimondo from antiwar.com. We're talking color-coded revolution, so stay tuned. right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Stuttering Scott. I'm talking with Justin Raimondo. He's the editorial director of antiwar.com. And we're talking about that very thing, coup d'etat, the great game is what they called it in the 19th century. Who gets to dominate Central Asia? It's surely not the Central Asians. So who's it going to be? America, Russia, China. And right now, American policy seems to be making sure that we're in place to control all those Central Asian resources, and we're getting it done by way of the color-coded revolutions.
Yeah, if I could just get back to
sure.
Azerbaijan. The reason, apparently, that they're giving Aliyev's son so much trouble now is because the guy's a playboy. He doesn't really want to be the dictator, I think, of Azerbaijan. He'd much rather be hanging out in the capitals of Europe, running around in a sports car and hanging out with the girls. So he is slated, apparently, for regime change. And I think we're seeing the first symptoms of it with that 10,000-strong We Love George Bush rally.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Yahoo News story right now. From the Associated Press by Adia Sultanova, Baku, Azerbaijan. About 10,000 opposition protesters chanted freedom and carried pictures of President Bush as they marched across. Sorry, I can't even read that without the confusion in my voice. As they marched across Azerbaijan's capital Saturday, urging the government to step down and allow free parliamentary elections this year.
Yeah, look at those posters.
Yeah, I wonder where those were produced.
Somewhere. Huh? Not in Azerbaijan.
Oh, that's funny. And interestingly, only, a week ago, you wrote an article all about the new pipeline that goes through there, right?
Yes.
This is a big deal, this Caspian oil fields, right?
Well, apparently not as big a deal as the oil companies thought. And this whole thing was started by Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, as soon as he got into office, set up a new government agency. I forget the official name of it, but it was essentially an office dedicated to handing out subsidies to Western, mostly U.S. oil companies to extract oil from the Caspian Sea area. And they estimated some incredible amount of oil was supposedly there, oil reserves, supposedly bigger than Saudi Arabia. It turns out it's not bigger than Saudi Arabia. It's smaller, though there is a lot of oil there. And, of course, with the price of oil going up, as we all know, even more valuable. So for a decade, all these subsidies were being poured into U.S. government-favored companies to set up operations there to have this pipeline. And the problem with the pipeline is that they've got to pacify this very tumultuous territory. I mean, Central Asia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, is not exactly a peaceful place. So a pipeline has to be guarded. So the profits of all this, of course, are going to be privatized, but the costs are socialized. That is, by you and me, the U.S. taxpayers. We're paying for this. And the oil companies are profiting. Of course, that's not free enterprise. That's state capitalism.
Mercantilism.
Yes. So I have to make sure that things are stable in these countries. Every country that this pipeline snakes through has got to be pacified. And it goes through Azerbaijan. It goes through Georgia. It goes right a mile away from Abkhazia. And there's another area in Georgia called South Ossetia, which is also fighting for its independence. And, of course, the pipeline goes pretty near that. So us helping the government of Georgia put down these rebellions suddenly becomes a matter of U.S. national security because, of course, we need oil. And we've already sunk billions into this pipeline.
Well,
that's how we get involved in wars.
It's all kind of based on this false assertion that you can secure this pipeline by supporting the central government. I mean, really all we're doing is sowing the seeds for future conflict. And when Georgia and South Ossetia are at war, our pipeline ain't going to be safe then.
You have to understand that South Ossetia and Abkhazia and all these other little mini countries are pro-Russian because under the Russians, they had some kind of autonomy. They were granted autonomy. But under the Georgian government, their very languages are outlawed. You know, for example, you can't speak Abkhazian in the schools of Georgia. And Georgia wanted to set up schools where only Georgian is spoken. So it's a matter of language and culture as well as politics.
And this is the kind of freedom and democracy that America is exporting around the world, right?
Well, you know, of course, you know, like democracy means majority rule, and the majority of people in Georgia speak Georgian.
There you go. Thanks a lot, George Bush. All right, everybody, we're talking with Justin Raimondo. He writes Behind the Headlines for antiwar.com. We'll be right back. My friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Justin Raimondo. He's the editorial director of antiwar.com. And, Justin, I hate to do this to you, but I got to ask you for benefit of the people in the audience. Antiwar.com sounds like you must be some hippy-dippy Green Party type. Am I right?
I don't think so. Look, you have to understand that conservatives were not always warmongers. It used to be that conservatives stood for putting America first and not some abstract idea of freedom for, you know, whomever internationally. I stand for limited government. I'm a libertarian, and antiwar.com is all about preserving our republic by not having an empire. You have to understand that empires don't usually have constitutions, or if they do, they tend to ignore them. So, of course, that's what's happening today. The more wars you have, the more the economy is socialized. War and socialism go hand in hand. So you have a centralizing authority in Washington that's seeking to extend its domain all over the world in what's called a New World Order. I think conservatives are pretty familiar with that. So what you have to do is challenge, you know, this kind of left-right dogmatism saying, oh, yes, you know, conservatives are for war and liberals are always against war. Well, that's not true. I mean, after all, who started most of the wars of the 20th century?
The Democrats.
The Democrats, and it's been liberals. And it used to be, of course, prior to the Second World War, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his pro-communist fan club that was calling for us to bail out the Soviet Union by getting involved in the Second World War.
This really all changed with the Cold War, right? Because it was a left-wing enemy, and so to be right-wing meant to be interventionist after that, right?
Yes, and it came out of McCarthyism because prior to the Second World War, and then right after we got involved, after Pearl Harbor, what happened is that there was a witch hunt by the left against the right. And they were trying to put all the old conservatives who had opposed us getting involved in that war, some of them, they tried to put them in jail. And they drove them out of the media, they drove them out of politics, and people like H.L. Mencken, John P. Flynn, whom some of your listeners might be familiar with, Garrett Garrett, all these people were driven out of the public forum. And so when the enemy became communism, what happened is that these people got their revenge. And they went on a Holy Crusade against communists inside the United States. But then that turned into a Holy Crusade internationally. So that a lot of these people, like William Henry Chamberlain, for example, who had written books against U.S. intervention in World War II, Chamberlain wrote a book called America's Second Crusade, they became interventionists. And so history has many strange twists and turns, and people tend to turn to their opposites.
Right. And this is really what you're addressing in reclaiming the American right.
Yes.
These neocons came and stole conservatism and made it a warmonger philosophy.
Right. And you have to understand that a lot of these conservatives around William F. Buckley Jr.'s magazine, National Review, if you look at the initial board of editors there, more than half of them were ex-communists and ex-Trotskyists. And the motives of these people, while many and various, were mainly involved with revenge. They wanted revenge on the Kremlin, on their old comrades in the Communist Party.
So it's sort of like, who hates the communists more than a bircher? The answer is a different kind of communist.
Right, or an ex-communist.
Yeah. Somebody
who has given up communism but not really become a conservative at all. A great example is Christopher Hitchens today. I mean, what does he believe in besides he hates all religion? He used to be a Trotskyist, and now he's George W. Bush's biggest cheerleader. So,
and now we're getting right into, this is a perfect segue into my confusion, which I hope you can clear up, about the splits between the neoconservatives and what I would consider the typical New World Order crowd, as you referred to it a moment ago. Christopher Hitchens is the guy who calls Henry Kissinger a war criminal. Yeah. And I know from the history of a lot of the neoconservatives, particularly Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, these guys were Team B. They worked against Henry Kissinger and what I would consider to be the typical New World Order crowd in the 1970s. And they also, with the Iraq War, seemed to really push the typical Rockefeller establishment to the sidelines. Before the war, Scowcroft, James Baker, Lawrence Eagleburger, Zbigniew Brzezinski all came out and opposed the war in Iraq. So where does this world government plot stand at this point? Who is running the show now?
Well,
how's that for a long, complicated question?
Yeah. I mean, as to who's running the show, well, it's not clear that anybody is really running the show. I mean, Washington is now in flux. There's a big struggle going on. And you have to understand the difference between the Kissinger-type realists and the ideologues, i.e. the neoconservatives. I mean, the neoconservatives could care less about the United States of America. They're completely divorced from any geographical allegiance. I mean, they like our military as, because they want to use it as their instrument. But, you have to look at Kissinger and those people and the realists, Scowcroft especially. I mean, they come from an older generation, most of them are older, that still recognize that the idea of American statecraft was to put American national interests first, that is, to advance our national interests abroad. Now, they had a very broad idea of what these interests were, perhaps a lot broader than I do. But compared to the neoconservatives, these guys are isolationists. And so there's a terrific struggle going on. And you can see the split in the recent snit at the National Interest magazine. There was a big fight between the neocons who walked out of the magazine and the realists. And, of course, the issue, well, not necessarily of course, but the issue was Russia. Well, I wouldn't call them pro-Russian, but the realists are saying, look, what do we have against Russia? I mean, what's the problem with Russia? Russia is practically a third world country. It's losing population. They're armed with nuclear weapons. They just overthrew the bloodiest dictatorship ever, worse than Hitler in terms of how many people they killed. And so then what's the problem? Why are we picking a fight with those guys? It's not a good idea. But the neocons could care less about reality or our national interests. They're very focused on their enemies, and Russia is one of them. And also, of course, Russia is not a perfect, democracy, so we have to go after them too. So, this whole idea of encircling Russia is a distinctively neoconservative idea, and the realists aren't buying it.
Well, so what about collective security in general? I'm sure you're familiar with Richard Pearl's screed in The Guardian, "Thank God for the death of the UN." And he says right there in the first paragraph that, they might hang around and do, some humanitarian mission here or there, but the liberal conceited idea of peace on earth through collective security and multilateral action is finally dead. Let's rejoice and throw a barbecue, basically is what he's saying. I hate to be thankful to a guy like Richard Pearl, but I hate the UN, and I don't like the idea of collective security either. I wonder whether you think the neocons have really done damage to the international structures that really America took so much time and effort to set up.
Okay. A complicated question, but I'll try my best. The UN, the neocons hate the UN for all the wrong reasons. They hate the UN because they see it as a constraint on their war-making agenda. Mm-hmm. They don't want to have to go to the UN and ask permission before they invade a country. If Richard Pearl wants to invade a country, it should happen tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow.
So this isn't exactly a Ron Paul opposition to the UN we're talking about here.
Yes. And what was the other part of your question?
Well,
I'm sorry.
The question's really about whether did Richard Pearl really come in and screw up what everybody in American foreign policy had been working for 5 decades, which is to widen and deepen the structures of international law, to create world federalism?
I think that the whole threat of the UN as some sort of world government was never all that big a deal to begin with. And it's not going to happen that way. I mean, if we have a world government, it's going to be the United States that's going to be that world government. And I think that the neocons realized this and said, well, then let's work to make it happen. Let's have the United States basically take over the world. Let's just conquer the world. So the Alexandrian position.
So forget the UN Security Council. We got the National Security Council, and that's good enough, huh?
That's a good one. Absolutely, yes. That's it, right there. And so this appealed to some conservatives, of course, who hated the UN. But what they didn't understand and don't understand to this day is that they're getting a world government anyway. And they're getting the taxes that come with it and the restrictions on civil liberties that come with it. And they're getting the terrorism on our soil that inevitably comes with it. And so, as Gary Garrett said, it's an empire in which everything goes out and nothing comes in.
Isn't that interesting? Usually in history, the empire benefits from all their colonies, right?
Right.
We're just bankrupting ourselves.
Right. I mean, it used to be that, yes, like the Romans would exact tribute from all these people and get some sort of material benefit out of it. Now, I'm not saying that we ought to do that, but I'm simply saying that the tribute is only going to Halliburton and certain companies that Richard Pearl has invested in. And so that it's yes, tribute is coming in, but we ain't seeing it, and we're paying for it.
Well, all these color-coded revolutions seem to have a lot broader support than just the neocon set that really pushed the Iraq War. I mean, George Soros, who spent I don't know how many millions of dollars trying to defeat George Bush, his Freedom House, they're the number one sponsors of these color-coded revolutions, right?
Well, yeah, though he's not with Freedom House. He has his own group called the Open Society Institute. And
so I thought that was just a subset of Freedom House, no?
No.
Okay.
No, Freedom House is different. Freedom House is the old kind of Social Democrats USA group. Jim Wolfe is the head of Freedom House, the former head
so that
of
is the neocons then.
Yes.
Okay, well, then that takes the premise out of my question. Let me try it again. Is there or is there not a broader sense of agreement on foreign policy circles in America and really in Europe about these color-coded revolutions?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the thrust of your question is completely accurate. I mean, you have to understand that, look, there's two big factions far as like foreign policy goes. And the first faction, of course, is the neoconservatives. They're in the saddle right now. The other faction you saw in operation during the Clinton years, and they're what I call the transnational progressives, or the George Soros crowd. And they basically started this whole color-coded thing, as I pointed out before, in Serbia and the former Yugoslavia. And they were behind this. George Soros subsidized a lot of that. And he continues to subsidize it inside the Soviet Union. So they tend to be less militaristic, more pacifistic, but they both want to achieve the same ends. George Soros would do it through the old left-wing UN kind of a world government kind of a thing. And the neocons want to do it unilaterally by just having the U.S. go in there and just take over instead of puppet governments like in Iraq, for example, or in Georgia. Well, no, actually not in Georgia. That's a Soros production. But anyway, through military means.
Right.
So, you've got two different methods toward the same goal, which is world government, world order, kind of like Star Trek.
Oh, yeah, that'll be a wonderful utopian paradise when we all wear uniforms and take orders from our captain.
That's it.
Well, I forgot what my next question was going to be. It was going to be a really good one. Well, I know. I want to ask you real quick about Mexico. It's sort of off topic, but sort of not. You got this Mayor Obrador, who last I heard was sitting in jail instead of being the #1 opposition candidate to Vicente Fox.
Right. That's kind of a complicated situation where you've got this mayor of Mexico City who is very popular. He was elected overwhelmingly, and he was slated to be the opposition candidate to the PAN, or the Party of National Action candidate, who's in power now, very pro-George Bush. I forget his name, the president of Mexico.
Fox. Vicente
right.
Fox.
And what happened was that they got him on a technicality. They got Obrador on this technicality where he had seized some land and they were going to build a road on it. And through some legal technicality, it wasn't quite legal, or there was some question about it. Anyway, anybody in Mexico who is indicted for any reason whatsoever cannot run for president.
And that's the real reason that he's been indicted.
Yes, and so now he's in jail.
Oh, hang tight right there. Everybody's Justin Raimondo from antiwar.com. We'll be right back.
7898.
Hello, this is Christine with BringThemHome.org. Are you a parent disinclined to seeing your sons and daughters used as mortar bait for the New World Order? With no end in sight to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, along with the looming possibility of an escalation of conflict into Iran and Syria, we need to send a definitive message to the warmongering politicians. Bring our troops home now. We have Bring Them Home magnetic ribbons, which are available in any quantity. Like the upside-down flag, these ribbons are inverted to symbolize a state of distress. Place these ribbons on your cars and help us wake up the sleeping public. Don't wait until the military draft is implemented. Don't wait until it's too late. Get your ribbons now. Your Bring 'em Home ribbons can be purchased at rbnlive.com or at bringthemhome.org, or call 877-605-9200.
All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. Thank you, Motorhead, for that wonderful introduction. I'm talking with Justin Raimondo, wrapping up the interview here. He's the author of Reclaiming the American Right, The Lost Legacy of the Conservative Movement, and he's the editorial director of antiwar.com. And I'm sorry to leave Mexico so quick, but I remembered what my great question was going to be that I forgot, which was, what happens when we're the last rogue state? Because that's basically what's going on here, right, is that we're taking all the rogue states that don't take part in the so-called international community, and we're forcing them all to join. But we're the exception to all of the international law that we force down everybody's throat. How long can that circumstance stay that way?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I had the answer. It's going to stay that way until the American people wake up and see what is happening, not only to their old republic, but to their sons and daughters as they're sent. That was a great ad you had about, don't wait until the draft comes. I mean, basically, that's what's happening, is that they're getting ready for more major wars. They're going to draft your sons and daughters, incredibly enough, and send them off to foreign hellholes. And until the American people wake up to that, it's going to be the same old, same old. But I have faith in the American people. I think that they will wake up one day, and in fact, I think that day is not long in coming.
Well, I'll tell you what, you're definitely right on point when you say we have more coming. I'm looking at an article that you guys ran on antiwar.com yesterday from the Washington Times. Cheney praises Iraq-Afghan wars is the headline, and he promises, quote, more great victories to come.
God.
Meaning, I guess, occupying Persia?
Yeah, it looks like Iran, though I would say Syria is coming quicker than Iran, because, of course, Iran is a very big country. Bullies pick on little guys. They don't tend to pick on anybody who's even close to their own size. So I think that Iran is kind of a handful or a couple of handfuls, whereas Syria is a lot more manageable. And, of course, there's Belarus, which is going to be the blue or cornflower blue revolution. They already picked the color, so you know they're getting ready for something.
Right, I saw that in the Financial Times from June 3rd.
Yes.
U.S. aids blue Belarus opposition, and I saw, as soon as I saw that headline, I thought, oh, they've already picked their color. It's on. Oh, man, look out. All right, everybody. Well, I tell you what. Listen, I got to say this again, and I'm sorry, Justin, it sounds like I'm kissing up. This guy's my boss. I work for antiwar.com, and so this all sounds very conflict of interest. But really, you've got to all begin to read Behind the Headlines 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Justin Raimondo will take a brand new topic in the news that you never heard of before, and by midnight tonight, he'll have a couple of thousand words explaining the entire situation to you. No better source for information on the Israeli spy scandal, Ahmed Chalabi, of course, the color-coded revolutions. Highly recommend Behind the Headlines at antiwar.com. Thanks again for your time today, Justin. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, talk to you soon. All right, everybody, it's the Weekend Interview Show. Weekendinterviewshow.com is the website if you want to listen to any of the archives. And these are the good old days, my friends, so enjoy them while you got them. We'll be back next week.